In this video, I would like to tell you more about enterprise applications and the risks related to enterprise applications. Because enterprise applications can potentially cause some data leak or stealing of refresh tokens of end users. And by default, end users can consent to enterprise applications. So let's start with some basic introduction to enterprise applications and what enterprise applications are and what those applications can do. Enterprise applications in general are applications that can access data or any information in Microsoft tenant. So any application that user wants to use needs to be first registered as an enterprise application in Microsoft Entra ID. In other words, if users want to use Apple Mail as their email client, Apple Mail needs to be first registered as an enterprise application in Microsoft Entra ID. By default, all Microsoft applications are already pre-registered in all tenants, and those applications are even not visible in the tenant. Those are there on the background and can be used. But any other application that users want to use need to be first registered as an enterprise application. So if your users want to use a third-party email client, such as Apple Mail, it needs to be first registered in Microsoft Entra ID as an enterprise application. The reason for that is that the application is used as a way for users to access some data, some information related to the tenant or that information that is available in the tenant, which is the reason why it needs to be first registered in the tenant. So technically the application gets delegated permissions to act on behalf of a signed-in user. If you want to know more about the details and the differences between enterprise applications and app registrations, I have another video that describes the differences between enterprise applications and app registrations. So I'm not going to go into the details. I'm going to really focus on enterprise applications and the consents to enterprise applications. So if you want to review your existing enterprise applications, open Microsoft Entra ID and go to Enterprise Applications. Here you see all applications that have been already registered in the tenant. As you can see, or actually as you cannot see, Apple Mail is not registered here, which means that my users from this tenant cannot use Apple Mail as the email client for accessing email and calendar and contacts and so on. If someone from my tenant wants to use Apple Mail, the Apple Mail application needs to be first registered here as an enterprise application. By default, end users can consent or are allowed to consent to enterprise applications, which means that if any of my users want to use Apple Mail client, they will be prompted to register the application. So when they sign in for the first time to the application, they will see a pop-up window in the application saying that this application needs some access, like the email, contacts, calendar, and so on. And they are able to consent to the application. Technically on the background, it means that the application that's registered, so will appear here on this list for this specific user that consented to the application. If some other user wants to use this application as well, the other user needs to go through the same process again, with just one small difference, that the application will not be registered here again for the user because the application is already registered here, but the other user will be just added to the list of users that are allowed to use the application. But the process for the end user will be the same. There is no difference for the end user. And like I said, it's potentially risky because for Apple Mail, it's probably okay. It's a email client, official email client from Apple. So there is probably no a huge risk related to using Apple Mail client. But imagine that there can be another application that will also want to access emails, but this application will be actually malicious. The author of the application will collect all the information that's downloaded to the application, so all emails, all calendar information, all contacts, everything, which leads pretty much to information or data exfiltration. It may then be used to phishing attacks, or very targeted phishing attacks, spear phishing, password spray, and so on and so on. Because the application itself has direct access to the environment through a regular user account. So it's risky. But it's not the only risk that's related to enterprise applications. There is another risk that's usually not known to even administrators. And the other risk is that the application obviously gets the access token and the refresh token for the signed in user, because the application acts on behalf of the user. There is the delegated permission. So it means that if the application is malicious, or even if the application is just poorly secured, someone else may, or the threat actor, the author of the application, may take the access token and refresh token from the application and use, for example, the refresh token to get access token to a completely different service for the signed in user. It potentially brings or creates a lot of risks and a lot of damage for the environment, because it's not only the permissions that the application got initially from the user, but via the refresh token, the threat actor would be able to get access to anything that the user has access, because the threat actor would be able to use the access token, the refresh token to get access token for any other service that's integrated with Microsoft Entra ID. So the risk of end user consent to enterprise applications is really large. And this is the reason why it's recommended to disable end user consent for enterprise applications. If you want to disable it, go to this security and consent and permissions. And this is the default config. Allow user consent for apps. This means that all end users can consent to enterprise applications. This is something we don't want. You should limit it at least to this allow user consent for apps from verified publishers for selected permissions. You can define the permissions that you want to allow end users to consent to. So if you go to permission classifications here first, you can define low risk permissions, medium risk permissions, or high risk permissions, and allow end users to consent to applications from verified publishers only that are asking only these low risk permissions that you define here. There is a list of 5 pre-suggested permissions that Microsoft considers as low risk. So you can start with this list of 5 permissions. You can potentially modify the list. You can add more permissions. It's completely up to you. And then you can allow end users to consent for apps from verified publishers for these selected low risk permissions only. Or you can make it even more secure and do not allow user consent at all. And this would be definitely my recommendation. Then, optionally, if you want to, you can allow users to request admin consent to applications. So imagine the situation with Apple Mail. Apple Mail is at the moment not registered in my tenant, and I have just disabled end user consent. And now the situation is that one of my users want to use Apple Mail. They are unable to consent to the application, and the consent is not registered in the tenant yet, and they are unable to consent to it. So it means they are unable to use Apple Mail. But what if they want to use Apple Mail actually? If you allow admin consent requests, users will see another or very similar window when they sign into Apple Mail for the first time that allows them to request admin consent. So it's very similar to the window with the actual consent, it's just small difference that there will be a text window for justification, and the button will be to request admin consent, not to give the application the consent. So if you allow this, and users will be able to request admin consent. Then you define the reviewers for the consent requests. So I will, for instance, select this Adele to be the reviewer for the consent requests. Then by default, these reviewers will receive email notifications for the end user requests. And these reviewers will also receive reminders for requests that haven't been approved nor denied. You can then configure also consent expiration or consent request expiration. By default, it's 30 days. You can make it 60 days maximum, which means that during these 60 days, your reviewers may decide to consent or not to consent. And if there is no response from the reviewers, the consent will be the request will be automatically denied. So if no reviewer approves the request within this period of time, the request will be automatically denied after 60 days. So this is a good way of this is a good balance between security and kind of usability or user productivity, because end users are not able to consent to applications, but users are able to request admin consent, and then your admins will review the requests, and if it's something that's business ready that you allow to be used in your organization, then the admins can give the application the consent, which means that all users in the organization then will be able to use the application. And if it's something that you don't like, you don't want to have integrated with Microsoft Entra ID, you don't want your users allowed to use, then you can simply decline the request and users will not be able to use it. And there is no way how they can bypass it. So that's the recommendation. This is something that's very often misconfigured in Microsoft Entra ID tenants. I see it quite often. So please go to these consent and permissions for enterprise applications, review the current settings and potentially change it and make it more secure. I hope you liked the video. I hope you liked the explanation. Don't forget to share it on your social networks, because I feel like it's quite important and it's good to spread the good words. And don't forget to follow my Cybersecurity World blog. You can also follow my profile on social networks such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Mastodon or Blue Sky, where you can find me by my name, Lucas Baran. And that's really all from my side for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.